Rachel Bomberger with Eerdmans Publishing. I'm here with Megan DeFranza. Megan, welcome.
Thanks so much for having me.
Tell us a little bit about yourself first and foremost.
I am an evangelical Christian. I grew up in the Midwest, a conservative corner of evangelical Christianity, in a Christian family, and wanted to serve the Lord with my life as I was raised to do in my conservative little church. And went off to Bible college in the hopes of learning how to serve the Lord in ministry, and then discovered theology. And so now I'm a Christian theologian doing education.
And you took a detour, I understand, through Roman Catholic circles along your way.
Like many evangelicals, I went to do my doctoral studies at a Roman Catholic school at Marquette University. They were very good to me there, always asking me to speak as an evangelical. Bring your tradition to the table.
Oh, that's wonderful.
Yeah.
Now tell us about the new book.
Do you want me to tell you the title again?
Yes, please.
The new book is Sex Difference in Christian Theology, Male, Female, and Intersex in the Image of God. So, as I came from this conservative church background, like many women, when I went off to college and to seminary, I encountered all sorts of questions about my fittingness for ministry. And as I wanted to pursue theological education, one of my professors said it would be a violation of 1 Timothy 2 for me to teach theology at the college level to men. Meanwhile, one of my other professors wanted me to go and get my PhD and come be the first woman in the department. So I couldn't really do anything but apply myself to biblical studies, to hermeneutics, to gender, to history and philosophy and all of these things in order to figure out my own calling. And along the way, I discovered intersex persons with physical characteristics that make it so that they're not clearly only male or only female in their bodies. And I'd never heard of them before. And I thought, how do we think about this as Christians? They're bringing questions even more different than the questions that I was asking.
Yeah.
And so I realized I started reading the theological literature on gender, and I was really dissatisfied with theologians writing from the conservative right as well as the liberal left. And I really didn't find accounts of sex difference that made sense of my own experience as a woman, as well as theological accounts of recognizing that there are persons who aren't clearly male or female, and how do we think about that theologically. So I knew there was work to be done.
Yeah. As women, we often ask, how do we fit? Where do we fit? And yet intersex persons have that question multiplied many times over. And what has been the traditional Christian response to intersex?
Well, depends on what you mean by tradition. More recently, in the last several hundred years, we've really lost our knowledge of intersex persons. And that has to do with medical advances and technologies where we really try to fix intersexed infants before they even know about their own conditions. And in the last several decades, intersex persons have been coming out of the closet in many ways to say the medical technologies that you intended for our good have actually not succeeded in establishing our bodies and identities as clearly male or female. And in fact, they've introduced all sorts of trauma. So in the contemporary time, there's really not a lot of knowledge of intersex. But if we look way back in church history, we find in the tradition many resources. Augustine in the City of God speaks of hermaphrodites or androgynes, persons who we don't know how to classify as male or female. He says they're rare, but every society has people that they don't know how to classify as male or female. In our society, we call them men. We call them by the better sex. Classic Augustine, right? Yes. But here he's saying every culture has these people. And in the early church, the language of the eunuch, especially naturally born eunuchs, there was at least language around in the ancient world. Now, it doesn't mean that eunuchs and hermaphrodites were always treated well. Laws about them changed depending on the culture and who was in power. But there was at least language and space for persons who didn't fit the category of male or female, and we've lost that today.
The answer wasn't to surgically correct the person as an infant and just not even think about it.
Right.
Yeah. Now, how does the presence of intersex persons complicate the traditional Christian binary of male, female, Adam and Eve?
Sure. As I was taught, Genesis, the narrative in Genesis about Adam and Eve gives us God's ideal. Mm-hmm. So this, God makes the world, makes male and female, and it's good. Mm-hmm. So anything that doesn't appear in Genesis 1 is somehow a result of the fall, it's not good, as if Genesis gave us all of God's blueprint for humanity and all of creation. Mm-hmm. And so intersex persons have been typically, their bodies have been examples of the fall by the few conservative theologians who engage with intersex. But when we look at the Genesis narrative, we find lots of things that aren't present. Mm-hmm. So we have these broad categories of creatures of the land and creatures of the sea and creatures of the sky. There's no mention of amphibians, creatures that bridge two different categories. Yes. And yet I've never heard a scientist who is Christian say amphibians, they're a result of the fall because they mix the they're not in God's good creation. And so we need to say, okay, is Genesis giving us Adam and Eve as the ideal for all times and places? Or do we need to think about those, are we bringing those assumptions mm-hmm. to the text? I think too about racial difference. Mm-hmm. If we're trying to get back to Adam and Eve, we'll lose racial difference. And yet, we don't just have Genesis, we have a whole canon that ends with this glorious vision of every tribe and language and nation gathered before the throne and worshiping. So we have racial difference, not in Eden, but in the new creation. And so I don't think that, I think we're trying to ask too much of Genesis 1, 2, and 3 to give us all of God's blueprint for a good creation, and anything that doesn't fit there is the result of the fall. I think that's a false reading. I think it's the beginning of the story, but there's so much more that God has done in the scriptures and in creation that we need to consider.
So how does the Bible allow for a more nuanced understanding of the spectrum of human sexuality?
I think one of the important things that I've learned was this language of eunuch. Mm-hmm. We see it in the Old Testament, but particularly as Jesus speaks about 3 types of eunuchs in Matthew 19:12. Those who are naturally born eunuchs, mm-hmm. those who've been made eunuchs by others, and those who make themselves eunuchs for the sake of the kingdom. Now, most of church history has been built off of an examination of the second type of eunuch, the castrated male, and its metaphorical reinterpretation as those who castrate their sexual desires and become monks and nuns, pledging themselves to religious service for the sake of voluntary celibacy. But it took the church a long time to get to that reading. In the first several centuries of the church, people were taking Jesus quite literally. So much so that the Council of Nicaea had to rule against castrating oneself for the sake of the kingdom. They said, please don't take Jesus literally. We'll tell you how to interpret this text. But people, even after that, would take Jesus quite literally. But we look over that first type of eunuch that Jesus mentions, the naturally born eunuch. In Jewish, in Hebrew, they were called the Saris Chama, the eunuchs of the sun. Since the first day the sun shone upon them, the community knew there was something different about this child. So here we have Jesus speaking about the naturally born eunuch, not as proof of the fall. He's affirming in Matthew 19 the goodness of being created male and female according to Genesis and what that means, the goodness of heterosexual marriage as the majority way of living in the world, and yet he doesn't talk about it as the only way of being in the world. He mentions these others. He doesn't make fun of them as many of the rabbis did. In fact, he holds them up as models for radical discipleship. It's classic Jesus.
Yeah. Are there other places in the Bible where you see clearly this alternative understanding of how intersex persons fit?
Another important passage comes to us in the book of Isaiah, Isaiah 56, 1 through 8. Here we have eunuchs complaining. Because in Leviticus and Deuteronomy, eunuchs are castrated eunuchs especially are excluded from the assembly.
Yes.
We have to look to the Tosefta, to oral commentaries on the law, to get information about Jewish inclusion of the Saris Chama, the eunuch, the naturally born eunuchs, which they included, pulled from the laws for men and the laws for women. They made space in their community. We don't get it in the Old Testament, but we get it in the Tosefta. But we do hear about castrated eunuchs complaining. So they're not allowed in the assembly, according to Leviticus and Deuteronomy. But they keep coming. They're part of the community. And they complain. And so Yahweh speaks through the prophet Isaiah and says, "Don't let the eunuch complain that I'm only a dry tree, for I will give them a name better than sons and daughters, an everlasting name that will not be cut off." What I think is significant about that passage is he doesn't promise them that they'll be made into men, that these eunuchs will be restored to their creational ideal of masculinity and ideal maleness so that they can marry and have children and make a name for themselves as every good Jewish boy was supposed to do. They're blessed as eunuchs. They're given a name better than sons and daughters, an everlasting name. So I see that as God saying, I see you and I bless you as you are. Another really important passage is Acts chapter 8, when we have the baptism of a foreigner. Foreigners are also show up in Isaiah 56, and it's an important passage for the foreigners and the eunuchs. And the first foreigner to be baptized in Acts chapter 8 is the Ethiopian eunuch. And he's reading in Isaiah when Philip starts jogging alongside the chariot.
I love that passage.
And we look at him as the foreigner, but we forget that he was not just a foreigner. He was an outsider to Israel. He knew the rules in Leviticus and Deuteronomy about eunuchs not being welcome. And so when he hears the good news from Philip, he asks, "Is there anything preventing me from being baptized?" Probably because he knew there are lots of things that prevent me from being in the community.
That's not an inconsequential question.
It's not a throwaway question. It's a real question for him because castrated eunuchs were not welcome in the assembly of the Old Testament. And Philip says, "Here's water." And he baptizes him.
Yeah.
He is baptized as he's not. We have no evidence in the New Testament of a eunuch ever being healed. We have other outsiders, the woman with the issue of blood, the leprous, even the dead, all categories that make one unclean and outside of the community, that persons who are healed in order to be brought in. We don't have a story about a eunuch being healed.
That he's brought in.
He's brought in as he is, baptized as he is. Again, it just sounds like the gospel to me. It sounds like good news. Good news certainly for persons with intersex bodies, but good news for the rest of us, because how many of us men and women feel like we fall short of some masculine ideal or feminine ideal? And to see that these are not values that are communicated to us in the scriptures, that we're all called to conform to the image of Christ, not to the image of Adam for men and the image of Eve for women, not even to Mary for women. And Jesus, right, exactly. But we're all called to put on Christ, and in our particularity and differences, and yet being made new and holy after the image of Christ. There's a lot there for us to think about.
Indeed. Now, one thing I wanted to get into just sort of briefly is how does this issue of intersex both align and not align with the conversations we have in Christianity about LGBT persons?
Right. That's an important question. Intersex persons have become pawns and collateral damage in the culture war that is going on in the church right now. So the left wants to pull intersex in as one more color in the rainbow, and the right wants to sweep them under the rug and pretend they don't exist. Intersex persons come in a great variety of intersex conditions, as well as theological perspectives. There are Christians who are intersex who are very conservative. There are Christians who are intersex who are very progressive. So to say that their bodies and identities are going to line up on one side or the other of that culture war just isn't fair to their particularities. Intersex persons have what they might consider an intersex woman who having a heterosexual relationship, but they complicate even the understanding of what is heterosexual. Well, how do I find someone who is other than me? Does that mean someone with a non-intersex condition or a different complementary intersex condition? It complicates the whole conversation, which of course we don't like.
No.
We want black and white rather than the beautiful living color that God has created the world in. So it's important to see there are similarities in the conversation, especially to understanding the biology of sexual orientation, which we all know is complicated. But studies on intersex persons do show the relationship to hormonal development and certain sexual identities. So there's important connection there, but it's not the same, and we have to be careful not assuming, as some Christians have said, that intersex is just a tool of the gay agenda. That's what Chuck Colson said years ago, and that's an inadequate response. We can do better than that.
Yeah, I think so. Now, speaking of doing better, what message of encouragement do you have both for intersex persons who are looking to live out Christian faith and also for Christians who want to become people of welcome to intersex persons?
Well, I think learning to read our Bibles better is a good place to begin, and recognizing that intersex persons have been among the people of God from almost the beginning, right? We find their presence in the Old Testament, we find their presence in the New Testament, we find their presence throughout church history. They are not new under the sun. And knowing that they have been welcomed by the ancient Hebrews, by the early church, both East and West, not always well, but at least recognized, I think should give intersex persons encouragement that they are part of the family of God, that Jesus saw them, acknowledged them, welcomed them, and honored them, and that we as contemporary Christians can do the same. We need their voices, just as we need other voices to come alongside us and help us think together about what it means to follow Jesus in the world today, what it means to be attentive to being healthy communities that recognize, that don't try to fit everyone into a box, not just intersex persons, but men and women and others among us. So we need everybody at the table so that we can together work toward becoming healthier communities.
Thank you so much, Megan,
You're
for
welcome.
talking with us. This has just been a fantastic conversation.
Well, thanks again for having me.